want to welcome you to our first lecture of the winter semester, the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, a lecture by Ambassador Daniel Fried on the West Democratic Challenge, Central Europe's variant, and what America can do. Before turning the time over to for an introduction of Ambassador Fried, let me introduce myself. I'm Alan Hick, and I'm director for the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies. We have a full program of events this semester, many of them up here, some of them down on the 5th floor where our offices are. You can get a calendar out on the tables out there, but let me highlight one event that is coming next week, the same time. We're having an event next week on pulling apart or hanging together separatism and nationalism in Catalonia, Scotland, and Northern Italy. That'll be down on the 5th floor for those who are interested. I also want to recognize our co-sponsors of this event, the Center for European Studies and the Copernicus Program in Polish Studies. We're delighted that you could make time at the beginning of this very busy semester to come and to hear from our guest speaker today. And to introduce him, let me turn the floor over to Ambassador Ron Weiser, who's regent of the University of Michigan, a regent of the University of Michigan, former ambassador to Slovakia, and one of the co-namesakes of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies. Ambassador Weiser.
My glasses don't help because you get to an age where even glasses don't help. But that being said, I'll see if I can see this. I'm going to bend over a little bit. But I want you to know how excited I am to have this introduction. Oh, I want you to know how excited I am to have this introduction because the gentleman I'm about to introduce you to, I first met in 2001 when he was the head of the National Security Council for Europe and Eurasia. Tell you a little bit more about that in a minute because anecdotes are better than introductions. But this may be an unusual introduction because there's so much to say about him that the introduction may be longer than the presentation. So we shall see. I'm going to try to keep it as short as I can. This man has had an enormous influence on the shape of Europe as we see it today. A Europe whole and free or mostly free and mostly whole. And that is a product of much of the work he did for many, many years in so many different positions in the government that's, I'm going to try to go over those very quickly for you. But I wanted to tell a couple of anecdotal things about my first meeting with him. And I went into his office, and I was about to go out to Slovakia, and he said to me, well, they have an authoritarian leader there by the name of Mečiar, and if he gets in office, then we're not going to support them in coming into NATO, and if they don't get into NATO, they don't get into the EU, and they end up back in the Russian orbit, and you got to figure out how to make sure he's not elected and don't get caught interfering. So I said, how do you do that? And he said, you'll figure it out. So anyway, but with his leadership and support, we were able to accomplish that while I was there. And the second time I met him, actually, and he may not remember this, he came to visit Slovakia because there was a new head of a country called Georgia that had just gone through, back in the early part of the last decade, a transition of separating themselves from Russia, and there was a man by the name of Saakashvili, if I remember, if that was his name, and I was kind of a fly in the well as these two gentlemen met. Saakashvili had been educated in Harvard, as I also recall, and he was, a really young guy who took this country out from under the Russian thumb, and Dan was there and was talking to him about the importance of making sure that they adhere to the democratic values and that we share here in Central Europe and in NATO and so forth. And that was something that it just hit me as I was thinking about introducing him today, making sure that as these countries emerge, emerging democracies, as they emerge, they continue to go in the right direction. Because it's endemic for them to go backwards quite often into where they came from through corruption or through otherwise. So let me give you a little bit of background on him. He spent 40 years in the Foreign Service because he started at 10 years old, I think, and he played a key role in designing and implementing American policy in Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. As a special assistant and NSC senior director to Presidents Clinton and Bush, ambassador to Poland, and assistant secretary of state for Europe from 2005 to 2009, Ambassador Fried crafted the policy of NATO enlargement to Central Europe nations and, in parallel, NATO-Russia relations, thus advancing the goal of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. I forgot that peace part, which is really important. During those years, the West's community of democracy and security grew in Europe. Ambassador Fried helped lead the West's response to Moscow's aggression against Ukraine starting in 2014. As the State Department coordinator for sanctions policy, he crafted U.S. sanctions against Russia, the largest U.S. sanctions program to date, and negotiated the imposition of similar sanctions by Europe, Canada, Japan, and Australia. Having retired from the Foreign Service in April of 2017, Ambassador Fried is currently a distinguished fellow with the Atlantic Council, and for those of you who are not familiar with it, the Atlantic Council is a major player in the directions of this country and influencer in the directions of this country with Western Europe and beyond. So I'm going to tell you just a couple things because I underlined them. He was coordinator for sanctions policy at the U.S. Department of State from 13 to 17, as I mentioned. Special envoy for closure of Guantanamo detainee facility from 2009 to 13. Assistant Secretary of State for Europe Affairs from 2005 to 9. Special Assistant to the President and NSC Senior Director for Europe in 2001 to 5. U.S. Ambassador to Poland from 1997 to 2000. NSC Director and Senior Director, Special Assistant to the President for Central and Eastern Europe in 1993 to 1997. And that's just a few of the things. He's received the Presidential Distinguished Service Award, the State Department's Distinguished Service Award, and I could go on, but I won't. So, whoops, sorry about that. So, Dan, I'll let you.
Ron, thank you for that introduction, and I will deny anything that I supposedly said to you when you visited me before you went off to Bratislava. It's not true. Ron's known me a long time. The only person here who's known me, well, Damon's known me a long time. Mel Levitsky has known me so long ago, he remembers when I had hair. That was decades ago, and I'd prefer not to think about that, but there we are. I would like to think that after a generation after the end of the Cold War, that the work that Mel Levitsky and Ron Weiser and Damon Wilson and I engaged in was over. And I would like to have a quieter retirement than the one I'm able to have. But here we are. The transatlantic community of democracies, AKA the West, was so successful after 1945, and especially after 1989, that we started taking this achievement for granted. And let's review what that achievement was. Under American leadership, the West enjoyed its longest period of general peace since Roman times, an unprecedented prosperity and democracy. We face aggression from without, including from Putin's Russia, but security challenges and attempted subversion from Russia is not new. What is alarming and dismaying are the doubts and divisions within the West, our questioning of our own model, of our own values, now the loudest since the early 1970s, and maybe since the 1930s. And these are the most difficult to deal with. The internal challenges have been years in the making. Their sources include economic stresses, stagnation, though that may be easing, the impact of new technologies on employment, which is one way of saying that a lot of industries are under stress and a lot of people and places have suffered. And no need for me to come to Michigan to tell you what that means. Widening income disparities, especially in the United States, now reaching Gilded Age levels. Political dysfunction or seeming political dysfunction in response to these problems. And issues of national identity and nativist reactions in a period of increasing ethnic diversity made more acute by the two problems I mentioned above. These challenges have combined to generate widespread doubts throughout Europe and the United States about the fundamentals of the West's strategy and the West's identity and its values that have seemed secure and settled since the early post-World War II period. We see the results in politics on both sides of the Atlantic. Much is being written about what is sometimes termed Central Europe's nativist and nationalist turn, including what critics say is illiberal democracy, something the Hungarian prime minister used himself, populism in Slovakia and Bulgaria, and an inward-looking nationalism in Poland. But this is not a problem unique to Central Europe. The nations of Central Europe face their own variants of a common challenge. But I'm here to talk about the Central European variant of this problem and to dig deeper into its roots. And I was a history major, not a political science major, so it shows in what I'm about to say. Central Europe experienced trauma of 2 generations of war and imposed communism, and a 3rd generation of successful but uneven and stressful national transformation. For Western Europe, World War II ended in 1945. For Central and Eastern Europe, it ended, in a sense, in 1989 or 1991. The country's experience varied. Poland had the worst war, and the Baltics the worst Soviet occupation, with even their nominal sovereignty extinguished until 1991. Hungary, Romania, Slovakia had an easier war, but were left with uneasy national memories of their forced alliance with Germany in World War II. Under communism, all the nations in Central and Eastern Europe suffered from frozen national memory and lack of responsibility, lack of property ownership, and thus few stakes in larger societies. Traits Marxists deride as bourgeois turn out to be essential virtues in normal societies, and these countries were deprived of the opportunity to develop these virtues. During the communist period, these countries carried frozen memories of the nation, in which a treasured recollection of an idealized past was often the only thing which people, intellectuals, but more broadly, had. In Poland, after 1956, the church and the peasantry existed as fragments of old Poland, alongside semi-underground intellectual life. Add to this selective amnesia about World War II. Sometimes there was a memory of heroic resistance, especially in Poland. But throughout these countries, there was the memory of some collaboration, or in some countries, organized collaboration, and even participation in the atrocities of the time. That's not unique to Central Europe. Think of France and its memories of Vichy. But it was part of the legacy and the burden. The communist period also included 2 generations of uneasy relationship between people and the regime. Some people collaborated outright and simply signed up. Others didn't, but they accepted favors, an apartment, a passport, a university for one's children, sometimes agreeing to inform. Oh, yes, on informing for the secret police, the point was not the product of informing. The information that one person actually provided to the services, that wasn't the point at all. The point was the agreement to do so, which was morally compromising. The point was to make everybody dirty. Few people could drop out of the system entirely. I note all this to understand, not to judge. We Americans are ill-placed to judge, given that Central Europeans had to make tough choices under bad circumstances, which we Americans had a hand in creating through our inexcusable absence in Europe in the 1930s. We look upon dissent in the communist period as noble and heroic, and we see the self-liberation in 1989 as a triumph of the good, and that's true on both counts. But we now, with a generation of hindsight, need to look back more deeply. In Poland, anti-communist dissent was massive. Solidarity in 1980-81 had 10 million members, a quarter of the entire population, and active, committed anti-communist intellectuals and activists numbered in the tens of thousands. We know that because those people were rounded up during martial law. Do a head count. By the late 1980s, mass dissent took place in the Baltics. The opportunity to join Solidarity meant that people could shed whatever compromises they had made with the regime and, in a sense, experience a moral rebirth. John Paul II understood this, very well, and his trip to Poland in 1979 was critical to this rebirth. But in other countries, dissent was tiny until the end. After 1968, the Czechs had mostly given up. There weren't actually a lot of people hanging out at the Magic Lantern Theater with Václav Havel. The systemic transformation that took place in Central and Eastern Europe after 1989 took place against this complicated background. And even in Poland, there were lots of people who had signed up one way or another with the regime. The fall of communism came fast, surprising even those involved in it. Transformation turned out to be massively successful, exceeding the most optimistic assessments at the time, which I recall. And I can tell you that many people who were paid to know better predicted that nothing would happen in Central Europe in 1989. And I've learned never to trust the experts giving you an analysis like that again. Always use your own judgment and listen to people in the region. The democratic governments that came to power in that year tried different approaches. The Poles and the Baltics, out of necessity, introduced the most intensive reforms. In Poland, in 1989, you had a country that was both poorer in absolute terms than Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and in the midst of a macroeconomic meltdown. They were desperate, and their results were the most dramatic, and they generated the greatest result. GDP in Poland has tripled per capita since 1989. The Czechs and Hungarians, with more stable conditions, believed in gradualism and achieved slower, though positive, good results. The Slovaks started with slow reforms, then no reforms, then tried the Polish model, fast reforms, and they caught up very quickly. Ron Weiser had something to do with that, by the way. The Romanians were confused in the aftermath of their bloody December Revolution and started their reforms 10 years late. They caught up too. For 100 million Central Europeans, the norms for a generation after 1989 were free market economics, political democracy, and liberal approaches to national questions and culture, even when socialist or nominally nationalist governments were in power. But they made these reforms against the background of 2 generations of history that I outlined earlier. Governments generally chose to draw a line on the past rather than settle scores or engage in deep truth and reconciliation processes. There were good arguments for doing so. Social peace rather than post-revolutionary purges. Post-communist elites, thus, were given space to function and to flourish, and many did so in the new openness, using their old party connections, generating resentment among many without such ties. Seeking European and NATO integration, Central European leaders adopted the prevailing West European liberal political and cultural norms. They had good reason to do so, but this approach left much unresolved. For one thing, it meant that anti-communist revolutions, often made in the name of the nation, as it was cherished and remembered, even idealized, resulted, in fact, in leaping into the post-national culture of modern Western Europe. And that culture was often not what many thought they were signing up to. As Brexit, the French Front National, and other right-wing movements demonstrate, the prevailing post-national political culture in Western Europe is not always as popular as people think inside the Brussels Beltway, and it does not speak for the whole nation. All of this took place against a backdrop of massive social and economic transformation resulting from free market reforms. Central European societies after 1989 were crashing through social, economic, and historical periods at 2 or 3 times the pace of Western Europe after 1945. The professional classes in urban young found new opportunity and new wealth. Younger, more educated workers found new employment. Many others did not. Warsaw, Bratislava, other capitals are modern European cities. Smaller cities, less so, though they also have developed massively. Still, in the smaller cities, prospects for young people are fewer than in the capitals. And when small-town Slovaks, Poles, Czechs, or Hungarians go to their capitals, they say sometimes that they feel foreign. In Poland, the phrase Warszawka, or the Warsaw elite, is used there like some in America use the term bi-coastal elites, and it has the same pejorative connotation. Everybody gained from post-89 transformations, but many gained massively and others gained only moderately. And people do not judge absolute gains, they judge gains in relative terms and against a backdrop of expectations. And in a larger sense, not everyone in Central Europe was as committed to a liberal democratic vision as the dissidents who largely led the post-1989 transformations. There were other visions of a proper nation. A gulf grew throughout Central and Eastern Europe between the European-minded new winners of the transformation and traditional people, rooted in a vision of the nation, who benefited and continue to benefit from European Union membership, but in some cases just don't buy into what is for them a radical new version of national life, both social and economic. And while all of this is going on, the West is undergoing another sort of economic transformation, away from heavy industry in some cases. So Central Europe catches it twice. The shipyard workers in Gdansk, the birthplace of solidarity, discover, ironically, that the new economy they helped bring into being put the Gdansk shipyard out of work. Now, these are real stresses, technological changes, social transformation, social dislocation. It leads to some political alienation. Add to this the 2015 migration debate in Europe and the exhaustion of the Central European liberal and social democratic parties who had largely traded off political rule since 1989. And that explains, in part, why nationalist and exotic parties have started winning elections in Central Europe. Now, it's important, this is a university, so I have to make a plug for trying to avoid the analytic trap of retrospective inevitability. Academics love this, so do policy people. We like to attribute major changes, like electoral shifts, to major causes because we like to think that there's a balance between cause and effect. And sometimes there is, but sometimes, including individual decisions, dumb luck generates outside unintended consequences. You know, the motorcade screw-up that results in the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. Like, if the motorcade officer had been a little more competent, no World War I. But you can't write that as a PhD thesis. Try it and see what happens. In Poland, the 2015 election that brought to power the current Law and Justice Party, a PiS in its Polish acronym, was a big deal. And it revealed an urban small-town split, sort of recalling our own split from the 2016 elections. But PiS's victory resulted not just from big things, it resulted in small mistakes from the opposition, complacency of liberal parties and candidates, bad tactical electoral decision by the Social Democrats, and just kind of weak weak campaigns and the strongest liberal politician having ended up in Brussels. And this despite consistently good economic news from Poland, the only country in Europe that didn't experience any of the recession. In Hungary, Viktor Orban, who started off as a liberal, yeah, I knew him when he was a liberal, has started adopting nationalist tropes from interwar Hungary. He won his first election because of the weakness of the liberal and social democratic opponents, but he also won it because of weak economic results for which Orban could blame the Socialist Party then in power. In any event, there we are. The Polish and Hungarian governments have followed policies which could be considered right-wing on values and cultural issues, and populist, even statist in economics. Although I must say this about the current Polish government, it has delivered a lot to its electorate. Child subsidies in its famous 500 zloty for second and subsequent kids per month, and it's risen in popularity. They have delivered for their electorate. But they've done other things. The current Polish and Hungarian governments have raised questions about their commitment to independent media. In Poland, there's a state-run TV network that now is a mouthpiece of the government, and there is a private, in fact, American-owned television network that sounds and feels like the liberal opposition. Fox News and MSNBC, the parallel comes to mind. And there have been discussion of Polish media law that would put the liberal network under some pressure. Poland's government has gotten into a confrontation with the European Commission through its persistent attempts to reform or, in the view of its opponents, dismantle Poland's independent judiciary in what some Polish experts regard as inconsistent with the Polish constitution. Both the Polish and Hungarian governments sometimes have indulged in populist anti-EU rhetoric, using tropes about the faceless Brussels bureaucracy imposing a foreign vision, even though both countries benefit from billions of euros in EU funding. Now, this again is not unique to Central Europe. See Brexit. Some in the government camp in Poland, though, have even added to anti-Brussels rhetoric, playing about in flirtation with anti-German rhetoric, with loose talk about World War II reparations. Now, this plays, you can imagine, like poison in Germany, which is, do I have to underscore it, rather important in the EU. I find that frustrating because I believe that in Poland there is a case for traditional conservative values. And there is a case for supporting national identity in opposition to the general post-national Brussels political culture. But surely the Poles, who were the boldest in post-1989 reforms, can find a way to advance those values without a confrontation with the European Union. And if God, honor, and fatherland, Bóg, honor I ojczyzna, are good things, as I think they are, the liberal constitution of the 3rd of May, 1791, is also deeply in the Polish national tradition. Now, today, as we were coming over here, Damon Wilson and I read about cabinet changes in Poland. There's a new foreign minister. There's a new defense minister. It may be that the peace government is going to do its version of the kinder, gentler second half of its first term. We'll see. I hope the Poles can find a way forward. There needs to be a place for conservative as well as liberal governments, but as I said, there needs to be a place for a conservative option which doesn't involve the confrontations we've seen. What is at stake and what are American concerns? As I've said, the United States should not and must not engage in partisanship. We tried to stay out of local politics. In practice, the United States supported Central and East European governments of the liberal right, nationalist right, ex-communist, social democrats, technocrats, peasant party, and downright weird coalitions. We worked with all of them, and we really didn't care. As long as the governments were more or less moving in a democratic free market direction, and more or less they were. We do care about nationalist politics if that means a dismantling of Europe, a weakening of transatlantic solidarity through NATO, and renationalization of intra-European politics, or actual moves toward authoritarianism. We fought world wars in the Cold War because of that. Given America's history in Central Europe, as champion of national aspirations and democracy during the Cold War, and of a united Europe during the generation that followed, America may have some influence. In some countries, we may have a lot of influence. If we do, we have commensurate responsibility. Our goal is not to substitute our partisan political judgment for that of democratic countries. The Peace Party, Viktor Orban, won elections. They have a base of support. They have legitimacy. We do want to preserve, for all of Europe and on both sides of the Atlantic, our common commitment for a democratic rules-based order, the free world order. The alternative, balance of power politics in the world and nationalism at home, was tried and found wanting. Millions died in the 20th century defeating variants of that model. So between the principles of non-interference and principles, what do? In life generally, and in Central Europe in particular, showing up is half the battle. The U.S. needs to be present with a strategic message of why the West and its values matter. The Trump administration has actually made a decent start through Vice President Pence's July visit to Tallinn, and though his message was mixed, President Trump's visit to Warsaw, both last summer. The administration cannot do it alone, and in Europe, the Trump administration has its own, let us say, baggage. So if I can make a plug, the Atlantic Council, along with other American civil society groups, have a role to play, particularly now, and we are. The 100th anniversary of the fall of empires in 1918 and emergence or re-emergence of nations in Central Europe provides an excellent occasion to continue. America may have taken Central Europe for granted. We may have thought our work was done. We thought that with NATO and EU membership, we could walk away. But we may need to invest in Central Europe and in Central Europeans for a new generation. That's one thing. Second, American messages to governments and society must take account of Central European concerns, especially their sensitivity toward their newly regained national sovereignty, including in the context of Europe's difficult debate on refugees. We need to be aware of the historical context, the three difficult generations that I discussed earlier. As I said, patriotism and national pride are good things, and Western political culture needs to make space for them. Patriotism can degenerate into chauvinism, but it is not the same thing as chauvinism. Third, we need to help the Central Europeans defend themselves against Russian aggression. I could give a whole talk about that, but that's not what I was here to do. I will restrain myself. But Russian aggression includes both overt military pressure and disinformation and propaganda, about which we're beginning to learn something in this country. And fourth, as a tactic without unproductive lecturing, we need to convey messages of concern if and when governments put at risk democratic fundamentals. We need to be judicious and not shrill. We need to be selective in our battles. We need not to accept simply the view of the opposition as truth, because even if they are old friends. We need to do our own work. The State Department under the Trump administration and some of our diplomats in the region have actually been doing some of that, and they deserve support. We should also urge the EU to move with caution before risking a split in Europe. I hope the EU thinks hard before responding to a perceived lack of European solidarity on the part of some Central European governments by going down itself that road of lack of solidarity. And fifth, American leadership in the West and the free world more broadly is indispensable. If we do not lead, others will fill the vacuum, and we will not like the results. We need to recall our American grand strategy, 100 years and 1 day to the day of Wilson's 14-point speech. Wilson gave expression, the first expression, to our vision, a crude, rough draft of what turned out to be the American century. A vision that included freedom for the nations of Central Europe and the Baltics. A vision that included the reintegration of Germany and Russia as nations, not empires. A vision that he could not realize in his time, but was realized in our time, and a vision which it is our responsibility to maintain and advance for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have about 40 minutes or so for questions. There are mics, so if you have a question, raise your hand. Ambassador Fried will take his own questions, but please wait for the mic to get to you before asking your question, so we can make sure we all can hear. Up here.
Right. You found me. Your role in setting sanctions kind of caught my attention because we hear a lot about those in a lot of places. They've been incredibly effective many times. Wonder if you have any thoughts on Russia and some of the, if there's anything you'd like to talk about.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I do, but don't tempt me. Sanctions can be a useful tool, not always. The chief rule of sanctions is they are no better than the policy they are trying to advance. Okay? That's one rule. The other rule is you have to mean it. Just don't go through the motions. With Russia, the Russia sanctions, we ended up meaning it. And we worked hard to implement them and negotiate them in cooperation with Europe. And that worked. I would be willing to bet rather a large amount of money, I'd go dollars to rubles, that Putin told his people, don't worry about sanctions, they'll never stick. I've got this one. And it turned out he didn't have anything. The Europeans deserve credit for holding, for more sustained strength than many people in Washington and in Europe gave them credit for. I sense you probably want me to go into the Trump administration and sanctions. If I do so, it's on me, so I'll do it. I think the actual policies of the Trump administration on Russia sanctions have been reasonable, but they were also forced to do it. Yeah, I do believe that the Trump administration in its early weeks was considering, well, the administration's the wrong word. Some in the White House were considering a unilateral rescission of sanctions in return for nothing. I cannot prove that. I believe I'm right. And since recent, I've held that view for several months, and recent developments suggest, yeah, it's true. The Congress acted in what I think is a textbook example of what the constitutional framers had in mind of blocking this route. And the Trump administration deserves credit for implementing the existing sanctions in a way that I would have been proud to do. Okay, so once you got over this initial temptation, the professionals in government, what's the phrase, the deep state, whatever that means, the actual people who take the oath to the Constitution did a very good job and this includes people at the NSC, did a good job of implementing the sanctions. Those sanctions have the Russians' attention. The Congress stumbled in this massive, complicated, uneven sanctions bill that came out last summer. They stumbled into one provision which has Moscow spinning. It's a report on basically the corrupt Russian elite close to Putin. It's a list of names. And it has focused Moscow's attention because, I suspect, the Russian elite is realizing that Putin's aggression, first against Ukraine and then against the United States as well as France, can have consequences for them. No, Putin will not protect them. No, the West is not cowed, intimidated, soft, or bought, despite whatever arrangements individuals might have made for themselves. And it has captured their attention. We need to take the Russian threat seriously. We need to take it seriously on the ideological level and in the level of disinformation. And I say this not because I believe Russia is civilizationally doomed to be its worst self. I don't. I think Russia could be better. I think Russia is actually perfectly capable of being a major contributor and leading member of the extended European family of nations as it was in the late 19th century and before the Russian Revolution. And to get to that better Russia, you need to resist the aggressive Russia we've got now. Much more to say. I'll stop. That's another lecture.
What are you doing after the lecture?
Well, you know, tomorrow I'm going back to Washington and sort of getting right back into these things, including Russia sanctions. You know, those are, it's a live issue and a moving target. And it's kind of a peculiarity of Washington that groups like the Atlantic Council and others, I mean, the German Marshall Fund, I don't want to be exclusive. There are several of these homes for various retired people and other refugees from past administrations, which occupy an odd place because we're working with the administration, a lot of people in it, and we're working with the Europeans, and there's a lot of work to be done along the lines that I've laid out.
Well, I want to second that, Mr. Ambassador. Roman Rewald from Warsaw. I am visiting, and I remember very well your input into freedom of Poland, and I thank you very much for it. I am activist at the American Chamber of Commerce, and we've seen how it works. And I want to relate to your words, because what we see right now, your 5 points are being realized as we speak in Warsaw by the current ambassadors and some emissaries from the State Department that we talked to in Warsaw. They are actually following your advice to the point, but unfortunately they hit a wall. They talk to Kaczynski, they talk to government, and no result comes. So we are all hungry for more. Maybe engagement like yourself and similar people who have great reputation in Poland would be helpful. But that's remains to be seen. I have 2 questions. One question relates to your preparation as a historian, so a historical question. Second is about the future. The historical question is, we all regret that EU did not step in when we saw in Poland deterioration of the rule of law and the makings of the republic. Democracy is there because they were elected, but they were not elected to change the constitution. They don't have constitutional majority as opposed to Hungary. In Poland, they do it as a matter of caduc law, as we know it in Poland. So the question is, the surprise is well and the question is whether the EU has been too slow in developing its integration and federation, and therefore failed to protect against the populist movement. That's a historical question. The question for the future is the following. When we talk to people in government, Kaczynski, they say, well, we are democratic. We want to bring real democracy, because that's what they say. And some of them, I'm sure, believe in that. They are sincere. But the problem is that they are dismantling the rule of law and republic, and therefore they are going to, whether they are use it for autocracy, I don't know. Maybe they don't. But what about the future? Can you see that support of the fascist movements within society, the anti-democratic populist movement could produce, when Kaczynski goes away, even worse government, and they could use the instrumentarium prepared by peace into the same way that it was done in 1934 in Germany.
I don't know how to answer that, because those are serious questions. I can't answer that with certainty. I think the United States needs to be present, we need to be principled, we need to be patient. That means we have to let Poland know that we care about them and that we care about their future. We have to be patient, because we can't snap our fingers or act like the namiestnik, the outside governor. But we have to make clear what we stand for. Now, that's easier said than done. How you do this is not easy. I don't think that confrontational tactics pay off. I think that we have to understand that what Central Europe is going through now is a reflection of all the historical stresses from 1939. And we cannot, and it was foolish of us to expect a kind of triumphant pageant of successful democracy step by step without detours. That said, I don't want to lower the bar. We need to be present, and the we is Americans, both government and society. The Atlantic Council, the German Marshall Fund, all of the people who are known to be friends of Poland. And we also want our arguments should give a space, as I said earlier, for genuinely conservative options. Those are legitimate. I remember the war at the top in 1990-91, and you remember that. And there were many people who said that only the liberal camp had truth, and that we should stay away from all the conservatives and ZHN and the Christian and the Christian national parties. But it turned out these people were actually not bad either. Right? We need to understand that there is going to be a space for Polish conservatism, but we have to help them find ways to advance an agenda that's, to advance their agenda in ways that are consistent with common values. Like I said, easier said than done. And ultimately, look, it's going to be the Poles that decide this, and the Hungarians and the Slovaks and everybody else. It's not going to be us. We can do what we can, and we should. And we should not leave them with the impression that we're indifferent. I think that we have some influence if we use it right, not clumsily or stupidly. And I don't know that that satisfies you. It doesn't satisfy me, because I don't have answers like this. I'm like everybody else, trying to peer into the future and figure out the right thing. But what we shouldn't do is not care. Oh, and we should not. There was a part of the early Trump administration which was in principle hostile to Europe. You know, all the talk about cosmopolitan values as opposed to national values. You know, I can't stand that kind of talk because it takes me back to the use in the Soviet Union and Poland in March 1968. Give me a break. I know what that stuff means. We should value Poland because it is the best Polish tradition, combines the conservative values of Polish history and the liberal values of Polish history, God, honor, and fatherland on one hand, and the Constitution of the 3rd of May, which is a liberal constitution, on the other. Look, don't get me down the road of Polish politics, guys. I spent too many years there and I can't stop, so I just will stop now.
Well, while all that's going on, and you've given the history of this horrible rule by the Soviet Empire for 2 generations, do you think, what's Putin going to do now in the midst of all this, and what's actually going on, and what is Russia trying to do to make these countries part of his sphere again?
Well, Putin combines the reactionary aggression of some of the czars with a kind of postmodern hostility to values in principle. It's just weird and creepy, okay? Putin wants to discredit democracy in principle, and he wants to discredit the West. And he's using disinformation to support the far right, the far left. Any radical is fine with him. I wouldn't be surprised if there's Russian money behind some of the anti-German, anti-Ukrainian, anti-Lithuanian, Polish nationalist groups. Why not? We see the Russians doing the same thing in the United States. If you're running a disinformation campaign in Poland, you're not going to get a big market for pro-Russian sentiment. You know, that's what you do in Bulgaria. You don't do that in Poland. What you do in Poland is play to the nationalist tropes. You got to fight the Germans. The Ukrainians, they've all, you know, you bring up World War II. And you lean on that. You just feed on the chaos. What does Putin want? Well, he wants a hard empire over the former Soviet Union, and he wants to cast a shadow over the former Soviet possessions in Central and Eastern Europe as much as he can and as much as we let him. This is not really a hard one to figure out. What's hard to figure out is what the hell good he thinks it will do with that, do him. Like, has he looked at the Far East lately? How many Chinese are there in the provinces that border Siberia, Eastern Siberia? How many Russians are there in the Far East? Yeah, that's right. I read recently that the Chinese are going over, buying huge tracts of land and ignoring even the Russian environmental laws, you know, clear-cutting timber, despoiling the land. We're a threat to Russia? Seriously? You know, where's the Hitler? Where's the Napoleon? Where's Polish Hetman Żółkiewski? You know, it's gone. So the Russians have worked themselves up into this anti-Western fit because, as one Russian put it to me when he was pretty deeper into vodka than he should have been, we know how to fight with you. It makes us feel comfortable. It makes us feel powerful. We're afraid of the Chinese, so we're pretending that doesn't exist. It is, yes, it's frustrating. Especially because, as I said, I think the Russians can be better than they are at the moment. However, don't think Putinism is not fate for Russia. Okay? One of the things I learned not to do was to straight line current events in Russia. Brezhnev was going to be forever. Gorbachev is going to be forever. The chaos of, you get the idea. You know, Mel Levitsky had the job in the U.S. Foreign Service I wanted to have and never had, which was the political internal chief, the person on the ground in Moscow sniffing around. And those people caught winds of change earlier than anybody else. And they understood that things would shift. And I'm getting that same sense again, but that's a different chapter.
Ambassador Fried, whoops, too loud, sorry about that. I noted down two concepts when you were speaking. One is showing up, which I believe in very strongly, and the other is leadership. I frankly, as an outsider to the diplomatic world, have difficulty in understanding what leadership really means. Does it mean you occupy the first row at international conferences and you always know the US is going to be presenting the ideas and the visions? So if you could expand on that a little bit.
Leadership means framing the strategy, at least in my view. Woodrow Wilson. I mean, the 14 points are astonishing. He goes over, Germany, when he issues the 14 points 100 years ago, Germany is still winning World War I. They've beaten the Russians. They're about to try to knock out the French before the American armies show up. And point one of Wilson's 14 points is, whatever the British and French and Italians, our allies, have arranged for their victory, nah, we're not buying it. We're coming in to win the war, and we're going to win it for the following reasons, not yours. We're not even in the war. But it's Wilson's way of saying, yeah, that American army that's about to sail over, this is what they're fighting for. You're welcome. That's leadership. We did it again, Harry Truman, outlining the basics of fighting Stalin and the Cold War. And we did it again, a little bit Bill Clinton, a little bit the Republicans after 1989. Right, expanding the frontiers of freedom. That's where America shows up. You're in the front row because you've got an idea. The current administration has trouble articulating a big idea. Its big idea during the campaign in 2016 was pre-Wilsonian balance of power politics. There are no values. Values are for suckers. We're looking out for number one. Well, that's not Wilson. That's Clemenceau. And Clemenceau was a lot wittier. I mean, he's worth reading. I mean, just for his humor. The guy, A-grade style, but what he stood for was France first. Like, what the hell kind of a strategy is that? The strategy that gave us 1914? Not interested. The other, but if you read the National Security Strategy document, it's very different. It implies fidelity to American grand strategy of building the free world, but it never states it. It sort of backs into it by inference, which is exactly what I would have done had I been at the NSC and tried to draft it under current circumstances. Now, I don't know this to be true, but I've written some of, helped draft some of these and read a lot of them, and that's how it felt to me. And American leadership means having our power in the window, so everybody can see it, but not talking about that, talking about our vision of the world. And then what you get is everybody pushing back against it. And, the French, as Clemenceau did against Wilson, they're going to slap you down. They'll smack you down. But they will smack you down and we'll get the first word. And then everybody criticizes it. And that's American leadership as we've understood it for 100 years. And I hate us being absent, because if we're not, the Chinese will be. And their vision of the world is not actually original. Okay, it's 19th century, sovereignty is all, balance of power politics, everybody gets our sphere, stay out of ours. Everybody gets their sphere, stay out of ours. That's, the American leadership is needed in those terms. And this, Reagan understood, he was in this the tradition of American grand strategy. So is George W. Bush. So was Harry Truman. So was Bill Clinton. Barack Obama, in his own, kind of cool way, right, was there too. They were all there. This administration depends on who you ask.
You mentioned in your talk that Western political culture should make space for nationalism, and I'm wondering if you could expand.
Patriotism and national pride.
Fair.
Okay.
But I may have naively assumed that nationalism was inherently bad, and I'm wondering if you could expand on sort of how it should make space
All right.
for patriotism.
So didn't you take the basic political philosophy course where they teach you that Aristotle writes every virtue has its corresponding vice?
He took my course.
Okay, right. So patriotism is the good side, chauvinism or nationalism is the bad side. But what I meant specifically, okay, so back in the Bush administration, I got this lecture from a European, both Damon Wilson knows who it is too, about how the EU was better than America. The EU had ascended to the next highest level of political organization because it was post-national. Whereas we Americans believed in a national vision, liberal in form, freedom and all that, but it was still the nation, and they were superior. I haven't heard much of that recently. The fact is, the European Union, for all its benefits, and I'm a big fan of it, because the alternative is war, right? So it's a good thing, but it does not have a political connection to people. People still identify with the nation. And one of the unintended consequences of the European Union is that by seeming to call into question the nation, it suggests that the nation is just another level of administration. Hence, Belgium regional separatism, the Wallonia and the Flemish, or Catalonia, or Scottish independence. Those are all unintended consequences of the EU political culture, which suggests that transnationalism and regionalism is superior. Now, I'm being deliberately critical more than I actually am, because I actually think the EU is a good thing, right? It's actually a great thing. But there needs to be, a Danish friend of mine and Damon said, I need to be allowed to be proud to be a Dane. And when I talked to him, I said, that you need to footnote that by saying that the Danish nation is not just ethnic. It's political, it's cultural, it's linguistic, but a Syrian, an ethnic Arab who grows up in Denmark, who speaks Danish, needs to be welcomed as part of the Danish political nation, full stop. Ethnicity and nationhood need to be separate. Easier said than done. Look at the United States. We have trouble with that, and we are in principle not the white man's republic. Not after Appomattox, at least in theory. So those are complicated issues, but there needs to be a place for national pride. You can't, part of the problem the Poles and Hungarians have with Brussels is that their defense of national culture is regarded as grubby and primitive. And these guys overthrew communism in the name of the nation. Now, not just in the name of the nation. Solidarity was the nation, and it was liberal political values and democracy in the West all at once. Just why it was so powerful. But, the left has often denigrated national pride. And when you surrender patriotism to the right, instead of sharing it with the right, you may not like the results. And that's a long-winded way of explaining what I sort of referred to. Take back patriotism and redefine it in terms that are compatible with democracy and the 21st century. Yeah, and good luck to us all, right? Easy for me to say. Yes, sir. Oh, okay.
Yeah, no,
Now.
I'm trying to get the microphone going. Hello? Oh, yes. Yeah, so first, thanks for coming. That was a terrific speech, and putting it all together in context is important. If I go back to things that were done during the Cold War, we still have some tools here that we can that we can use that are not crude tools, they're subtle tools. We can compartmentalize. We can compartmentalize with the Russians. There are things we don't like about Russia, but as we did, I remember when I was serving in Moscow and you were just a student studying the Soviet Union at the time. You know, one of my beats was looking after Soviet Jewry and trying to understand what was going on. And that administration, Nixon and the Ford administration, managed to lever the Soviets at the time into something they didn't want to do, which was to allow a group of people to actually leave. Because if you talked with young people and others, particularly the dissidents that I used to deal with, their big thing was not being able to travel, not being able to go outside the borders of the Soviet Union. So all I'm saying is that I think there's room for what I would call a kind of principled realism where values mean something. But yeah, American first, there's nothing wrong with that. That's what diplomats are supposed to do. But it's not America alone or America only. You have to rely on allies as well. I think there's some, well, I hope there will be some, not so much a change, but a kind of gradual evolution in this administration. And I don't know whether this is possible at all, but a kind of gradual evolution in the administration that shows, you know, you have to work very closely with your allies, but you also have to work very closely with your so-called enemies or your prospective enemies. And engagement, I think, is always the way to go. If you're unengaged, you know, you're not going to have any leverage over the situation. I think we even have some leverage in Ukraine. You know, Crimea is a hard one because Putin can't give it back in any way. But we can certainly do some things in the eastern part of Ukraine that would, in fact, get the Soviets out in a way. So I think there are some, I appreciate what you were saying. I think, you know, Americans have been very practical, and we can find ways to actually have some levers and some leverage over that kind of situation, and even in Poland. I mean, there's no reason why we shouldn't be talking to the Poles about it. Come on, look, you know what the history is. We've always supported Poland. We've a lot of Poles in the United States, after all, right? Chicago, go to and look at Chicago. But we can support you only strongly if you abide by your own, what you say your own goals are internally, democracy. And we can have a good deal of influence. I think we can have more influence, frankly, than the European Union in many respects, because we've always had that kind of image in Poland. Could apply to some other countries as well. So I just wanted to make that comment. And again, thanks for your
I think that's basically right. You have to be able, that's what I meant, and you said it better than I did, about patience and persistence and principles. As far as working with adversaries, I think Nixon and Kissinger did it a little bit. I think George Shultz did it brilliantly under Reagan. Because what he did was say, we are going to push back against the Soviets in Afghanistan in ways that are going to hurt them. And we're going to work with Gorbachev, who offers something different. And we're not going to be hung up by the seeming disparity between cooperation and pushing back. That's their problem. We decide where we push back and where we cooperate. Best Soviet policy we ever had. America first and is not America alone. And principled realism. Sure, and that is a reasonable set of headlines. But what I would like to see from the Trump administration is more explicit understanding that America's grand strategy for 100 years has been rooted in an understanding that our national interests were tied up with the extension of a rules-based system and our values. I mean, to put it kind of bluntly, we wanted to make the world a better place and get really rich in the process. but then we wouldn't get rich if others weren't getting rich either. Right? And that's, you know, yeah, America first, sure, but how is that understood? I do not want to see us reduce ourselves, diminish ourselves to be not just another grasping great power looking for our cut. You know, America doesn't have the sphere of influence. We have planet Earth, and we want to make it a better place. Let's not think small. But that's another discussion.
Time for one last question. Got one mark right behind you.
Thank you for your lecture, your talk. The cultural aspects that you described and the political aspects and ideologies, you did not mention anything about the banks and the financial underneath some policy. Does that affect, you know, the international banks and the banking that is there?
Well, I'm not sure quite how to go about answering that. There was no banking as we understand it under communism. After 1989, in the Polish case, the one I know the best, banking reform was one of the more successful reforms. Because there were no banks, they had to build them from scratch. I mean, the communist banks weren't banks at all, and that actually worked better. As it turns out, building institutions from zero, like a stock exchange, is a lot easier than reforming existing institutions like the coal industry. So that actually, banking reform worked pretty well. However, there are also problems that have arisen with Russian dirty money and money laundering and corruption of the banking system coming in, and that's not just Central and Eastern Europe. There are a lot of questions about Western banks and the way they conduct business. I think in the context of dealing with sort of the Russia challenge, dealing with Russian dark money and the way it flows into our systems is something we have to look at. I'm not a banking expert. I know people who are. There's also the separate question of the role of U.S. banks in the Great Recession, the financial crash of 07-08. I don't know that that was ever addressed. I mean, in some ways it was. I'm not the person to ask about this. But there are several pieces of this. And then you're getting into a question of the overall health of the Western economy, and now that our economies have recovered, now's the time to start putting into place longer reforms if we could do it. But that's a separate issue. Anyway, I'm not your guy. I'm not your person on this. You know, I saw one tiny piece.
Well, I just meant that you spoke about ethics.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to be any sort of an overall ethical principles in banking.
Well, you know, that's an issue. I think, look, a modern economy needs banking regulation which forces transparency and honesty into the system, and the ethics derive from that. But again, I'm not your guy on banking.
So I'm going to take prerogative as chair to ask the final question and get your thoughts on if you were going to designate one priority for the current team that's designing policy towards Central Europe. What would you want to place on their agenda? What needs the most attention, or what action would you suggest we take or continue to do if we are doing it? But what do you see as the most pressing priority at present?
They need to do two big things in parallel. One, they're doing. The second, they're sort of doing. The one thing they're doing is working with Central and Eastern Europe through NATO on at least the military aspect of the Russian security challenge. That's a big deal. Obama starts out with the reset, and he ends up reversing 30 years of American military drawdown in Europe and sends American forces and leads NATO to actually put forces into the Baltics and Poland. An American armored brigade in Poland? That's what we have. And like the Poles have said, hey, we've been waiting for that for 75 years. About time y'all showed up. Like, that's really cool. Missing is the disinformation part, the counter-disinformation part. But then we have to do that in parallel with dealing with all the other issues we were talking about today. We're not doing it just to defend territory. We're doing it to defend our common civilization. And that has to be done in parallel. But it has to be done, you know, somebody said, well, why don't we just withhold military defense of Poland, you know, until they do what we want on democracy issues? And I don't like that. So I'll end this with a story, sort of putting all this stuff in context. So the day of the American elections, 2016, this veteran solidarity old dissident, I won't name him, but somebody who's known, basically liberal views, but, you know, like a glorious background of dissent. You know, a tough guy, you know, not elite background at all, comes in and he says, you know, I don't particularly like the current government. And I said, well, let's tease this out. Are they as bad as the communists? He said, what are you talking about? Of course not. I said, okay, are they as authoritarian as the government in the late 1930s in Poland, which was a European government, but it was sort of authoritarian, and it had those tendencies. And he said, no, they're better. Even today, it's better than that. Okay, should we have, the United States, have defended Poland in 1939 against Hitler and Stalin? He said, of course. I said, okay, well, you've just outlined where I think we should come down. And he liked that. We have to defend, we want to defend Central and Eastern Europe. They're part of NATO. And at the same time, we want to work with them. You know, take notes of what Mel Levitsky was saying. That's how you talk to a government about stuff that's difficult. And you have to do that at the same time. And the ones, you know, I liked Trump's speech in Warsaw mostly, and he took the time to get the history right, the stuff about the Warsaw Uprising and the narrow, you know, the stretch across Jerusalem Avenue was wonderful and heartfelt, and all Poles loved it, left to right. But he didn't talk about post-1989 successes. He dropped that. And I bet you that was deliberate. And that's a mistake. Poland's successes and Central and Eastern European democratic successes do not belong to liberals or conservatives, but the whole nation. And that's where we have to start. And we have to learn how to do this stuff right. Anyway, don't let me go on, because I will.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Ambassador Fried for a wonderful discussion.